Okay, this is now the second podcast on photosynthesis for Standard 2.4. In this podcast, we're going to take a look at the two reactions that occur during the process of photosynthesis. These are called the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions, which are also known as the Kelvin cycle. So we're going to start with the light-dependent reactions. So just as their name implies, they do require light to occur. And they happen within the thylakoid membranes of the chloroplast, because remember, the thylakoid membranes have the chlorophyll within them, and the chlorophyll is what is going to be absorbing the energy from the sun. So that's the main job of the light-dependent reactions, is to get the energy from the sun. So the chlorophyll will trap the energy from the sunlight, and also during this part of the reaction, we're going to use the water, and the water is going to get split into some hydrogen ions and oxygen gas. So this is where we're going to make our oxygen gas as a waste product, and this is where we're going to get our energy from the sun. Those hydrogen ions that are going to get made are going to be used later on in the process of making the actual sugar. Okay, so for the light-dependent reactions to occur, there are certain things that you have to have present within the cell. You have to have sunlight and water. You also have to have ADP present. And remember, ADP is our lower energy molecule that gets converted to ATP when we want to carry energy around. So it's going to help us to carry some energy during this whole process. And another molecule that's very similar to ADP is NADP+. It also does this energy carrying process, and it does that by bonding with hydrogen. So it's going to kind of serve two purposes. It's going to carry some energy for us. It's also going to carry hydrogen over to the Kelvin cycle, where we're going to use it to make our high energy sugars. So all of these different molecules are going to work together to go through a very complicated chemical process. So let's take a look at some steps that are involved. So what happens within the light-dependent reactions? Well, number one, chlorophyll is going to trap that energy from the sun, and it's going to transfer that energy into the ADP. And remember, when you put energy into ADP, you're going to end up making ATP. So we're going to make some ATP during this step of the reactions. That's not ATP that the cell is going to actually be able to use. That's ATP that's going to be just carrying energy for us. Okay, this happens as an electron transport chain between the photosystems that make up the thylakoid membranes. So remember, we said the thylakoid membranes have all of those pigments and proteins that are grouped together in very specific ways into kind of little areas called photosystems. And what's going to happen is electrons are going to be bounced around on these photosystems, and as they move around the photosystems, they are carrying energy with them. Okay, so the electrons get energized by the sun, and they're going to move through the electron transport chain. And actually, as they do this, they are keeping hydrogen to one side of the thylakoid membrane. So all the hydrogen ends up kind of pumped to one side of the membrane. Now remember, molecules don't want to be where they're overcrowded. So we have a special molecule called ATP synthase that's going to pump the hydrogen ions back across the membrane. And as it does that, it is making ATP. So if you look at the name ATP synthase, synthase means it's an enzyme that is going to make ATP. So this particular little molecule here is going to be moving hydrogen ions through it, and as it moves those hydrogen ions through, it's going to make ATP. And remember, that energy that's going into making the ATP came from the chlorophyll trapping the energy from the sunlight. Okay. So this is a really complicated version of what we're looking at, but basically what I want you to concentrate on here, photons, that's our light energy. So here's our light energy, and it comes in, and here's a couple of electrons. Those electrons are going to get excited by that energy, and they're going to move through these different proteins on the electron transport chain through these photosystems until they get all the way down here. Now, as those electrons are moving all the way through, hydrogen is going to end up all on the inside of the thylakoids. And so the hydrogen is going to get pumped through this ATP synthase, and as it does that, we're going to generate ATP. Now, as the electrons are moving down through this chain, they are generating NADPH. Now, both of these molecules right here are carrying energy that came from the sun. So we have to get that energy that just got trapped from the sun, and we have to get it into the stroma so that we can put it into the sugars. Okay, so the energy from the sun came in, We excited some electrons and they moved down and became part of NADPH. Okay, and we also had some hydrogen here that's going to move through this special protein, and that's going to generate ATP. So NADPH and ATP are going to carry energy for us, and now they can be used in the light-independent reactions. Now also during this step, water is split, and that's where the hydrogen ions are coming from and the electrons that are needed for the electron transport chain. Okay, so getting that water to split is an important part into getting the components that we need to carry the energy. Now a waste product of this is the oxygen gas that gets generated from splitting the water. That's going to get released as waste to the atmosphere. But we're going to use the hydrogen and electrons that come from splitting the water, and they're going to carry the energy for us. So the hydrogen is going to bond to the NADP+, making NADPH. Okay, and then the ATP and the NADPH, remember these just said those guys are high energy. Okay, so they now are carrying energy for us. They're going to be sent to the stroma of the chloroplast. So they're going to take all that energy that we just absorbed from the sun, and they're going to carry that energy over to the stroma. Now, in the stroma is where the Calvin cycle happens. These are called the light-independent reactions because they do not require light to occur. Okay, so they'll take place in the stroma, not require light. And the end result of the Calvin cycle is to make our high-energy sugar. In this term, we're going to be calling it glucose. It could be any of the different sugars, but we mainly refer to, in photosynthesis, the making of glucose. So within the stroma, we're going to make our glucose. So what do we need in order for this to happen? Carbon dioxide is going to come in from the atmosphere. We're going to use that carbon and oxygen from the carbon dioxide to make the sugar. We also need the ATP and the NADPH that were formed from the light-dependent reactions, because remember those guys are carrying the energy that's going to go into the sugar. Okay. So what happens in the Calvin cycle? The carbon dioxide is going to enter the stroma from the atmosphere, and the ATP and the NADPH are going to enter the stroma from the light-dependent reactions. Those happen in the thylakoid membranes. So we're going to get our carbon dioxide coming in, and we're going to get our ATP and our NADPH. Again, they're carrying all that energy, and they're going to come together within the stroma. The ATP is going to get broken down into ADP, and remember when that happens, we end up releasing energy. The NADPH is going to go back to being NADP+, and again, we're going to release some energy, and we're also going to release hydrogen. Okay, so if you think about what a sugar is made of, it's got carbon, it's got oxygen, and it's got hydrogen. So now we've got the carbon, the oxygen, and the hydrogen available to make our sugar. So the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen are going to come together, and they're going to make our glucose molecule. And you can see our carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen that make up that glucose. Now, this whole process is much more complicated than I just made it sound. There's a lot that has to happen in here, but basically what happens within the Calvin cycle is we're going to take and combine the carbon dioxide and the oxygen together to make the sugar. The ADP and the NADP+ that were just reduced over here go back to the thylakoids, and they will get used again in the light-dependent reaction. So they're going to get recycled by this whole process. And then the light-dependent reactions can happen again. We get the energy again, and then this whole thing just keeps happening over and over again, back to the Calvin cycle. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We're going to kind of summarize it up. In the light-dependent reactions, energy is harvested from the sun, and in that process of getting the energy from the sun, we are going to make a bunch of ATP. Okay, so that's where the energy is going to be temporarily stored. Water is split, and when the water gets split, we're going to release the oxygen gas as a waste. But more importantly, we're going to be making this NADPH, which is carrying that hydrogen for us. So here we're carrying our energy, and here we're carrying our hydrogen. The NADPH and the ATP carry their energy to the Calvin cycle, and that is where, with the carbon dioxide, they are going to make your new high-energy sugars in the form of glucose. Okay, so all of this happens within the chloroplast. So we're going to take that energy, we're going to put it into the ATP, we're going to split the water, put the hydrogen into NADPH, combine it with the carbon dioxide, and we're going to end up with our glucose as our end product, and that's where all of that energy is now being stored. Okay, so here's a graphic of this that we can label. We can look at it. So here we have an entire chloroplast, and it's showing you that we have our light-dependent reactions happening within a thylakoid. So this represents a thylakoid. And then here's the Calvin cycle that happens out in the stroma. So as we take a look at this, remember we get sunlight that comes in, and that sunlight gets absorbed in the thylakoid membranes by the light-dependent reactions. Also going into the light-dependent reactions, we have that water. Remember, the water gets split, and the sunlight brings its energy in. We end up making ATP, carrying the energy, and NADPH is carrying that hydrogen, and oxygen comes out as a waste product. So here's our oxygen as a waste product. So the ATP and the NADPH are going to carry their energy and hydrogen over to the Calvin cycle. They're going to combine with carbon dioxide within the Calvin cycle. They're going to drop off their energy and their hydrogen. The NADP plus and the ADP go back over to light-dependent reactions to get their energy again. And the carbon dioxide combines with the hydrogen and the energy and makes our high-energy sugars as the end result of this entire process. Okay, another way that we can look at this is by looking at a concept map. We're going to add a little bit into this. So photosynthesis has two different reactions to it. You have your light-dependent reactions and you have the Calvin cycle. The light-dependent reactions have to happen before the Calvin cycle can. Okay, the light-dependent reactions take place in the thylakoid membranes, and they're going to use energy from the sun and also water. And in that process, they're going to make ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. Now remember, the ATP and the NADPH, they're right over here. So they're going to get used over in the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle takes place in the stroma, and it uses ATP, NADPH, and then also the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And then in that process, they're going to produce their high-energy sugars. And that's what is basically being stored when a plant does photosynthesis and makes its own food. Okay? So we always have the light-dependent reactions gathering the energy. The energy gets gathered into these molecules, which then combine with the carbon dioxide and allow us to make our sugars over in the Calvin cycle.